each presenter will have 12 minutes to present his work and 3 minutes for Q&A short session, maybe. So our first speaker is Mr. Abbas Zaytoun. His presentation is entitled Sketch to Code, a framework for automatic code generation from hand-drawn sketches. This was done under the supervision of Dr. Al-Zarat. So, please go ahead.
Thank you. So, in most professions, and particularly professions that involve some design aspect, the first step of the design process is usually to sketch something. This is because sketching is a very natural, it's a very intuitive way of expressing a rough skeleton of an idea. But usually after this first sketch is done, which takes maybe like 2 or 3 minutes, the professional then has to take the sketch and then they have to go to their own program on their PC and then recreate that sketch from scratch using their own program. For example, this is a sketch of the user interface. This is actually one of the projects we had a couple of years ago. And after we recreate the sketch and the program, this is what the program looks like. Now, even though these two figures are very similar, the time it took to go from the first sketch to the next program was around 90 hours. And it took actually about 2,000 lines of code for something this simple. That's not even very refined. But then again, sketching doesn't have to be limited only to user interfaces. For example, say someone wants to design like a corner of a street. So first they can sketch it, and then they could fit it to the actual map using their own program. Or maybe someone just wants to visualize something, like they have a flow diagram, and then they want to have a better version of it, maybe in a paper or publication. Maybe someone doesn't want to visualize something at all, so they just want to simulate something, such as if they have an electric circuit. They just care about the voltage and current values. Now, what if I told you that we can go from something like this, from a sketch, to the end result automatically with a single click of a button? Well, that's exactly what we were thinking about, me and Dana and Kevin, when we first started our FIP project at the beginning of the year. Initially, our idea was, what if we can take a sketch of a user interface, a sketch like this, and then map it automatically to something that very strongly resembles it. So if you look at the sketch, the squiggly lines represent text, the square represents an edit box, the circle represents a button, and the boxes represent the check boxes. And if we take this sketch itself and then run it through our program, this is what we get. And all of this is just with one click of a button. You can actually see the similarity between the two. Now, unfortunately, the demo is not working on this PC. If you'd like, we are going to be available in the Creative Achievement session at the end, if you'd like to see a live demo there. But for now, what you need to keep in mind is basically this. This is how it works from a user's perspective. You have a sketch. The user just selects which library they'd like, or which design they'd like, what target application they're after. They click a button, a code is generated. They click another button, and then they get the end result. So how does all of this work? We're going to keep it at a high level and just go over the basics. Initially, we have an image, something as simple as a square with a circle and a triangle. And then we take that image, clean it into black and white pixels. We pass it to a shape detector to detect the shapes themselves. After that, we group the shapes into what we call components, which are essentially patterns or groups of shapes that have a high-level meaning. These components could be anything from a square containing a circle or a triangle or anything else of the sort. Once we have these components, we pass them to a code generator to generate code snippets with properties that help us order those code snippets at a time, such as a priority or an ID. And then the end result is just to order these things, we get a code file, and that's it. We can just compile it and run it. Now, if you've been paying attention to the shapes we've been using so far, we're just using triangles and circles and squares. And they don't really have to be tied only to user interfaces. Like, what if we just did this, for example? Here, what we're doing is we're beginning to move towards like a storyboard or a comic story. The next step, well, we don't really have to have circles and triangles. What if we try stick figures? And stick figures are still technically shapes, so we can still do that using the same framework, the same design, the same everything. So what we're going to show, what we did next was we took such an input comic strip, and we generated a 3D animation out of that automatically. Now, if you pay attention to the comic strip and to the video that we're playing, you can see that the character does exactly as shown in the comic strip. It places one hand to its face, then two, then two, then one, and so on until the end. All with a single click of a button without needing to mess with any of the internals of the 3D animation engine. So it doesn't really have to be only user interfaces for animation. It could be anything. Anything that can be sketched on a paper and then mapped to code can be designed as a library. And the only thing that's required for our framework is just the input shapes, such as circles, or a resistor, maybe a color, maybe a stick figure, anything. We obviously need the code samples to know what we're generating for each shape. And we have what's called a target library, which is really a suitcase word that contains a lot of the small internals, such as what are the priorities of the different components, or what the components are, how to group them together. Then optionally, what the library designer can do is they can provide either their own classifier for different shapes, maybe they're after performance or something, but they don't even have to provide classifiers. We do that for them. We can classify shapes after only seeing like 15 of them, 15 instances of each shape, automatically out of the box with above 90% accuracy. The library designer can also add other library internals that don't matter that much. But the thing is, they can just implement this once, and then the process of generating code from a sketch becomes completely controlled by a framework without the need to do anything else. So how does this compare to other current systems? Well, ever since we started working on the project, which is at the beginning of the fall semester, some other companies have started to have shown interest in working on such applications. In particular, in the middle of the fall semester, Airbnb released, they didn't actually release a framework, they presented something that they were working on, which presents, which generates from a sketch of a component on a page, code in their internal design language that is then transferred into code. However, some of the limitations of what they do is that they only support around 12 components in general, not shapes, components. So if you have something with like a header and then there's an image under that, that counts as one thing that they can classify. If an image is above the header, above a title, then that's another thing that they can classify. It's only limited to one language, and one of the positive things that they have, they only need about 5 images per class, but it's still a very narrow application. In comparison, Sketch to Code automatically does this and more. So the next company that started working on this was Microsoft. And a group of people at Microsoft and the winter break roughly, they also were trying to generate skeleton code for Visual Studio from an electronically drawn sketch. Now, some of the limitations for that are that it has to be electronic. The laptop has to have a touchscreen, for example. I can't run it on my own laptop. They can only support six classes, such as a text box or a label or an image, which are exactly the classes that we started off supporting in the beginning of our project. They can support handwriting also, but a lot of the reviews were actually complaining that because they support both of them at once, and because it's not exactly clear when the user is writing what, it's actually facing a lot of errors. So then the third company that was working on this was IBM Research in India. So what they did was they took papers, and from those papers they just they took a few diagrams, flow diagrams. They only supported one kind of diagram, the 2D box diagrams, and they also had to be digitally created. They couldn't, someone couldn't sketch them and generate code out of them. And then they generated code also in one language, as opposed to being flexible to support more than one language. And that code ran, but it had an accuracy of about 80%, I think. So it wasn't even that accurate. So how does all of this come into play? Well, essentially, the way that our framework works is it takes an input sketch, it has a library. From from a user's perspective, the person doesn't even have to, the user doesn't have to worry about how it works internally. They just have a sketch, they generate the code, they compile it, they get a GUI, and that's it. Or any other target application. From a library designer's perspective, they just need to implement the library according to our API once, and that's it. From that point on, they can just automatically generate sketches for as much as they like. So sketch code provides this unified pipeline that allows anyone to extend it. And the end result is that it allows the average user, the average day-to-day user, to generate code without even needing to know how it works or why it works, with a high percent of accuracy, with a single click of a button. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, and maybe 2 minutes for a couple of questions. Thanks. Do you know anyone from the audience?
So I have a question. If you want to build a GUI, do you choose which language you want the GUI to be created on? For example, being a non-computer science or engineer, the only language that I probably still remember is Visual Basic for application. Will this support it, or it's just coded with some specific languages?
So the thing is, it can support as many languages as a person would like. It's designed in a way that's general enough so that it could support Visual Basic, it could support C++, it could support Java, it could support anything. Now, for the demo purposes, we'll just stick to one language, which is C++, but it's not limited to any language in particular. Any other questions?
And the user needs to be aware of the legends that you use. For example, if you're using a rectangle for a text box, the user has to be aware of that and use rectangles, not decide to choose a pentagon or whatever. So there has to be a learning curve, which is not too steep.
Well, obviously, yes, but the shapes are chosen in such a way that the difference between the shapes and the final thing they see on screen is very simple, so that we don't need to worry too much about how to learn it. Text box looks like text box because they're both the same. So
this drawing or sketching program, does it, or can we use it for 3-dimensional drawing or just 2D?
Currently, we support 2D versions. That's because out of the box, but I don't see why we can't support like a 3D environment and then convert that to code. It's essentially the same as what we're doing now, except we just have to, add third dimension and compare things, use that to compare things.
And do you think that can be used, for example, to generate engineering drawings, even sketches, sketches of engineering drawings?
Well, actually, I think so. Yes. Like if you look back at the beginning. For example, this is something that we see in software a lot. It's essentially the finite state machine. We see this in hardware design. So we can use our program to generate something like this. It's not limited to just that, though. You can extend it to literally anything that can be parsed visually. Like we give an example of maybe a map. Like if someone is like a landscape architect, maybe, or a civil engineer or something. They're designing a part of a city. This is very easy to parse and then generate. You can also use it.
You generate what's on the right and not on the left.
Yeah. You can use any program you'd like as long as you can interact with it using code.
That is not as easy as it looks like, because if you look at this sketch, it's not an exact replication of the map. So is the code smart enough to detect those changes of scale and lack of alignment and things like that?
Well, I think yes. It all depends on how the particular application is implemented.
You have to think more about that. I think it's not easy from a perspective.
I mean, we can't. The thing is, we can't generalize to almost everything immediately. I think it's not real. You can try to do things probabilistically, but that's not always going to get you the good answer. What you could do is you can have a default skeleton. For example, from what's on the left, you can generate something that's very close, that's like 90% like what's on the right, and then you edit that part manually, and then you get the remaining 10%. So like you do have access to the code, and you can edit it if you'd like. It's not it's not necessarily an end-to-end thing, and you don't have any interference in between.
Just one question. Does it have a link to GIS? I wasn't here at the beginning. I mean, it would be nice to see that it would have an option where there's a link to GIS and actually read from the actual map. Then you would the actual site, for example, that you're drawing.
Yes, it's geographical information.
Oh.
Yeah, so I think it could be done. However, the emphasis here was mostly on transforming a sketch to something, because that's essentially what people start with when they're designing something. They just sketch something within like a minute or two, and then you'd like to transform that into an 80% or 90% finished product without doing a lot of work.
Oh, thank you. So we have to move to the next talk. Entitled Tackling Language Anxiety, abstract by Anna Hammoud.
Control F.
Just click on that. Yeah, click on that. Adult tool. This one.
No, you try to.
This slide.
No, full screen. Control F.
Okay, hello. I wish my English was broken and my Arabic was hidden. The first time I read this quote, it really touched me personally, because having moved from France to Lebanon only 4 years ago, I was extremely shocked to find that the negative view of Arabic of people my age wasn't different whether they had lived here or not. This is, of course, an observation of people that were around me and not a general overview of all people my age. And the idea that, in fact, the English language or French language seemed friendlier and easier to me and people my age, even if they lived in an Arab country, was extremely disturbing for me to find. And for that reason, I decided to kind of dedicate my thesis to the Arabic language and to look into the issue of language anxiety in Lebanon and the issue of language anxiety with the Arab youth, and look into case studies in order to answer the following question. How can graphic design be used to create an accessible experience of the Arabic language? So you might be asking yourselves, what is the motivation behind working on something like this, and why don't we just embrace the foreign languages and just start using them everywhere, and why are we trying to hold on to our own language? So research has shown that many language experts have actually stressed the importance of the mother tongue, and including Joseph Brown, who stresses the importance of the mother tongue in shaping a society. He claims that language connects the individual in social time and social space to fellow nationals whom he or she will never hear, meet of, or know. So language isn't only important as a tool to communicate with people now, but it's also important to connect you with the ancestors, to transfer knowledge, to transfer skills. And the renowned writer and journalist Amin Malouf also stressed the importance of language and the importance of keeping your mother tongue. And he warns his readers that, in fact, adapting a foreign language would lead to an unhinged and disoriented people with personalities that are imbalanced. And there are many similar arguments by many other language experts that have been pointed out. So language is important in shaping societies and shaping our identities, because language is one of the main parts of our identity. Dr. Mohammed al-Batal, who is actually a professor here at AB and has taught Arabic as a foreign language for many years and started something he calls linguistic Arab Spring, disagrees with people who claim that the Arabic language is in danger and that the issue is with the language itself. In fact, he points out three main issues. The first issue issue is that of content. So he claims that most of the content generated in Arabic is extremely irrelevant to readers and it has become outdated to some extent. Issues of design. So he compares the design to design in other languages and finds that it's something that's not as approachable and friendly as content in other languages. And the final issue is that of learning experience. So the whole experience of learning Arabic, whether in school or outside of school, is something that has become very dull. And he especially points out the shift from the playful, lesser learning stage in kindergarten to the reading stages, where you move from something extremely fun and playful to something extremely dull and didactic and really not engaging. In the classroom, for example, it's much more the teacher talking than some kind of interaction. So for that reason, I decided to look more into that early stage of reading where the students move on from something where they learn letters to extremely dull and dry reading. So for that, I've looked at the example of a book called Lughat Farahi. This is a page from the grade 4 book. And this is the first most shocking thing to notice is the difference between the 1998 issue and the 2012 issue isn't that, they aren't that different, and you can see a very similar white empty space, the setting of the typography. You can even see the same element that's been reused just in a different house. So it's actually something that's really shocking to see that over all these years. And by actually talking to the designer of this book, I found that, in fact, she doesn't have that much freedom in terms of designing. The design of this book is dictated by the author. The author is a teacher who dictates the design, gives the designer, in fact, some sketches and tells her, please do this. And anytime the designer tries to create some playful typography or try to use a different font or try to create something fun or interactive or some games, the teachers and parents reject it and try to reduce the book to the least pages possible. And here we have a simple comparison. This is the 4th grade book used in the same school in the same grade for English. And you can already see a drastic difference between everything, basically, between the illustration style, between the content. Here you have a story about the boy who invented TV. You have different illustration styles. You have the typography that's set very differently, and the whole composition of the page that's working much better. So to look into the issue of content, I have looked into the work of Khazin al-Nabad. He was an Egyptian graphic designer. He found that actually children are interested in topics we think are much older than them and too complicated for them. So he decided to take it upon himself and went and gathered all this content and produced books. One of them is called Mulahazat. So these books are divided into several issues, and each page is actually one topic. And he tries as much as possible to include topics that are relevant to their country, and for that, and as you can see in the compositions, he already divides the information. So he's making the information seem as simple as possible in dividing it. And in the page, you have the division between the text and the images. So you're really reading text, seeing an image, and not just reading long text. And the idea of choosing local content is also really important in strengthening the identity that we discussed earlier. In terms of learning experience, there also have been many examples. One of them is Marion Bataille, a French graphic designer, who worked with these manual, these pop-up kind of tools. So here, the reader has to contribute to the tool itself in order to learn. So it's not a passive learning experience. In fact, it's an active learning experience where the reader engages in it. And we also have the example of Dad Umbuz, who created also many tools that try to create a more pleasurable learning experience with cutouts in their magazines, or a book that teaches them about birds where they use shadow theater. And finally, we have hyperactivity typography, which is a book to teach its readers about typography. But instead of having, in fact, there's no factual information that's presented. All the information is presented in the form of games, and this is really important because play is one of the main human instincts. So here, instead of presenting the serious information in a dull manner, they created familiar games like connect the dots be a millionaire. So all these familiar games serve to teach you this information that's usually presented in a dull manner. And finally, we have the format of a periodical. So how can this information be presented? We've seen before that there's an issue of something looking boring or dull. So here we have a newsletter that presents mostly local content, and it's actually only the cover, the inside spread, and the back. So they chose a very friendly format in order to approach their audience and divided all the information. So it's not one long text. Instead, it's in a small section. So you have here these 4 sections and the facts at the bottom and the game and the comic in the back. So they're trying really to cater to the young audience's short attention span. And the idea of frequency is also very important because instead of having one book that's just read a bit and set aside, you're having this very frequent exposure to your language and to content that's relevant to your culture. And the last example is Political Agenda, which is meant to teach the young audience about rights. And so in each issue, you don't have any long text. They use illustrations or comics or conversations or questions and answers in order to present this kind of information that's usually seen as being very dull. So finally, the project proposal, as a result of this research, the project proposal would be to create a periodical in Arabic that has content that's relevant to the culture and country in order to strengthen the local identity. So not only present the Arabic language, it's also strengthen the identity. And this could also have interactive elements that would always engage the audience. So it's important to have something short, to have the division strategy, to have the frequent exposure to all these elements. And the audience of this would be around 10 to 12-year-olds that have started this very book reading stage and are experiencing the dull experience in the long texts in school, for example. These are some of the references.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I have a class I have to answer. Thank you for letting me first. So one thing about the Arabic language is that it's a phonetic language. People used to learn it phonetically in the days, and it was easy for everyone to learn it. 1-2 months, and people mastered the language. Even before the problems in Syria and Yemen, people will send their kids or send people interested in this language, go to Sahara for 2 months, and they are experts in Arabic. They can speak as if they are natives. So I don't see that difficulty. Probably the problem is either in the content. You started from the axiom of Dr. Mahmoud al-Batal, but you should question that. And obviously, you found plenty of examples that contradict what he is assuming. You found plenty of examples where you have content that is interesting, you have layouts that are modern probably, but even if you dig deep, illustrations of the Quran, illustrations of the Hadith, illustrations of the Prophet's stories, you have plenty of things like that. If you dig deeper and don't depend on the axiom of Dr. Batal, which I definitely respect him, but that's still an axiom or an assumption he has. Probably you should visit more literature. You already did. And half of what you showed us here contradict what he said, because the content is interesting. The illustration, as you said, is fine. What is missing in here is the strong point of Arabic, which is the phonetic key.
But he claims that the issue isn't in the language itself. You're saying that the language is very easy to learn. He doesn't say that the language is difficult to learn. He's saying the way in which it's presented today is.
He said content, learning experience, and there was a third dimension. So the content isn't. There are plenty of content. The schools don't pick it, but the content is out there.
The problem is the schools, I think.
Yeah.
What our children learn.
In the things that the schools pick.
Every single teaching book.
Yeah.
My advice is to question that. There's plenty of content out there.
But is that content presented in a way that's accessible? Would a 10-year-old go and
okay, I have kids and they like the content we present at home. They don't like the content that the school gives them. We managed to convince the school to include some, but the school has a problem. But it's not. But in terms of the content, يعني هذا اللي عمله بس it's an advice.
Questions? So we talk about the anxiety of the language. Do you think this can be maybe resolved or reduced if we use the proper Arabic or the spoken? Would that make any difference? In Lebanon, we're using the formal Arabic language versus the Lebanese accent.
I'm going to give you Dr. Ahmed Bakar's
Your opinion.
because I agree with what he said. He recommended to keep using the formal Arabic, but to always use the word that sounds simpler and friendlier. So instead of saying yajib, we can say lazim. Both are correct, but for him, just these choices of words are what's important. It's not completely changing to the informal Arabic, because it could be problematic, especially because each country has their own dialect. So if I were to produce something in informal in the Lebanese dialect, then it couldn't be spread to, for example, maybe in Egypt they wouldn't understand some of the expressions, and then it wouldn't be possible to spread it as much. And maybe the idea of spreading it is important because the more countries it's going into, the more you'll have, the more encouraged it will be. So if I'm making a book only for Lebanon, it won't be as
Because you have to focus on the local identity,
Yes.
country where this should be done. So I thought by saying that to refer to something like this, that
Well, it was more focusing on the content that has to do with the local history, the local geography, local influential figures, instead of always having stories about Europeans or the geography or wars that happened outside.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we can move to our third speaker, Mr. Madia Al-Khouri. His talk is entitled Radio Frequency Categorization, Establishing Safe Working Parameter at a Novel Study Using Acoustic Sensing. That's a chemical engineering thing. Okay.
Hello everyone, my name is Fea Ideas, and today I was presenting a talk about the catheter ablation in the heart arrhythmia. I'm an undergraduate research assistant, and this has been done in the experimental tool done in Islam under the supervision of Dr. Mohammed Awais, and it was done in association with the top catheter, especially with Dr. Marwan. So what we're going in the general outcome is going to be in the background, the experimental setup. And the main results are here: the ablation dynamics, the contour and probability, angle of catheter, and acoustic analysis. And I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible, and hopefully I'll get the message across. So we're going to start by defining the background of this study. So what's heart arrhythmia? Simply, it's when the heart is not beating in sync. It's not that when it does not have a correct rhythm. Usually, a way to fix it is by using a catheter. They insert it from the foot up to the heart, and they use a procedure called ablation. Ablation is the surgical removal of tissue. In this case, what they do is they burn a specific tissue that's responsible for the misfire, and thus triggering the heart to beat not in sync. What we're going to do is see what might happen in a bad scenario and how we can prevent and fix it. So the parameters that we're going to try to use and manipulate are the power. The power is the electrical power at the tip of the catheter. So it's going to go through the from the catheter to the specimen itself. The time is the exposure time, the time of the catheter, the time the catheter is in contact with the specimen. The weight is actually the force of the catheter on the specimen. It's going to be fixed because 20 grams is the most clinically relevant one. The catheter angle is simply the angle between the catheter and the specimen. And irrigation status is actually it could be one of two modes, since the catheter can be irrigated or not irrigated. And irrigation simply means a saline solution is coming out of the tip of the catheter to cool down the sample. So what setup is here? Actually a relatively simple setup. It's a plexiglass container. The specimen is here at the center, and this is the catheter in red. So what we do is we lower the catheter, we ablate a specific area, and then we move on. In this case, it has three ablated areas. We have two acoustic sensors. This is a hydrophone's acoustic sensor. The relevance of these two will come shortly. So what we get is we ablated a sample, we take it out of the container, and we take a top view image. This is the top view image. You can see three ablation locations, 1, 2, 3. And I would like to note that this specimen is actually a piece of ovine heart or sheep heart. This is the left, the left ventricle, and it's the myocardium. The myocardium is actually the heart muscle. And then what we do is we take the top, we take an image of the top, and then we cut it in a cross section manner, and then we take this cross section picture. What we do is we import these two images on MATLAB to measure the depth and width of the ablated volume or the burn volume. So the first result that we established is we wanted to understand the dynamics, what was happening here. So what we did is we plotted the volume versus power, the volume of the ablated tissue versus the power, and what we realized is that we had a lot of differences and it was varying a lot. So we tried to understand why. And this was actually because the piece of meat or the specimen was varying in thickness. Even if it was taken from the left or from the right ventricle, which have different thicknesses, it would vary thicknesses within the same specimen. So we wanted a way to standardize it. It's like going from force to stress. So what we did is we took the ratio, which is the depth of the ablated volume over the total depth of the specimen itself. This would allow us to standardize our data, and we can see this is the same data, this case and this case. You can see that the values are quite narrower and quite, it's more convenient. And what I would like to note here is in the legend, I don't know if you realize it's no pop or pop. So you're probably wondering what's a pop? What's the issue of a pop and why am I putting it in the legend? This is actually the most important part of the experiment, and this is what we're going to tackle very soon. A pop is actually when the myocardium is made of different tissue, and between each tissue we have layers of water. So our body is composed up to 60% of water. So if we heat the catheter up to a certain point, this water will boil, and we will move from the liquid to the gas. And when we have this scenario, we have a sudden expansion. And sudden expansion is like a little explosion. And this might actually rupture the myocardium, which is very clinically bad. It might endanger the patient. So what we want to do is understand when this popping is occurring and how we can prevent it. This will be a very clinically relevant. So what we realized is power, in this case the pops, they start at 25 watts. And we're going to move on. Now what we're going to do is we're going to vary power and vary time and see how this is affecting our specimen. So in all the presentation, the pops is going to be an X and the no pop is going to be an Y. So what we did is we developed these graphs which are varying in time and power. And what we did is we plotted them and we just want to see the general trend. What we take is the left ventricle, which is the thicker one, and we varied time and power. And what we did is for each point we plotted the probability of popping as a circle in order to visualize it better, and the diameter of the circle is proportional to the probability of popping. So simply put, a bigger circle means a bigger probability of popping. And the contour that you see here is actually just an interpolation between the different points. This graph, for example, is about 120 data points. So what we did here is, for example, the blue area is the safe area, we have a 0 probability of popping, and the yellow area is where we have 100 probability of popping. What we first theorized is that the probability of popping actually depends on energy. So For example, the higher the energy, the higher the probability of popping. However, this actually turned out not to be true. If we take an energy of 700 joules, which is for example 55 seconds and 20 watts, which would be about here, we have a 0% of popping. However, if we take a 35 watt and 20 seconds, which would be here, we have a probability of popping of around 60 to 70%. So for the same joule, the same energy, we have a contradictory result. So it's actually not enough to use energy as a way to model the probability of popping. We need to use power and time. And if you realize power is actually more important than time itself. You need to vary time by a lot to start popping. However, power is just by actually each increment is 5, each increment is by 10. And this two graphs actually shows the importance of irrigation. This is for a left ventricle irrigated catheter. This is for a left ventricle not irrigated catheter. So you can see how the importance of a saline solution that's cooling the system. Well, the same thing was also done for the right ventricle, and you can see that the blue area is much smaller. And this is logical since the right ventricle is smaller, it will require a lesser power and time exposure for it to pop. Makes sense. So now that we've done this, we want to see if this is applicable for all catheter angles. Since we started with a 90-degree catheter angle, we wanted to move on to other catheter angles. This would be actually a more realistic scenario. Since the contact between the catheter and the heart doesn't always happen, it's always in vivo. And the clinician or the cardiologist is using an ultrasound to guide the catheter. So it's not always a clean contact. So what we did is we varied from a 90-degree, and I'd like to remember that the 90-degree is actually the catheter and the specimen. It's not from the normal. So what we did, we varied from the 90 to 60 to 45 to 30. And in all of these scenarios, when we combine them, we got that they all start popping at 25 watts. This is the original one I showed in the beginning. This was the third one. So we can see that they all share this characteristic at 25 watts, making the previous probability maps applicable at all catheter angles, which is something very good. So now that we've got this covered, the ablation dynamics and everything, wanted to see what could we determine from the acoustic sensing. So the first thing that we did is we had a microphone, and we knew when it could pop. So what we did very simply, we made it pop, and we studied the acoustic scenario. What we did is we had several cones. We knew when it's going to pop. We placed the parameters that we determined from the probability maps, and we made it pop. And we recorded the acoustic sounds of each pop using the hydrophone. When we did this, we integrated it, and then we correlated it with the measured ablated volume. So we have an ablated volume and an acoustic signal for each pop. We got the integral and we got the volume. I know the figure is not very clear, but we were able to see a positive correlation here. And simply, it was the bigger the pop, the louder the pop, the bigger the ablated volume. It would translate to this. So, moving on, we use this graph in here, but I will explain it first, the precursory bubble and listening. So what we use then is a microphone, or a hydrophone, which has a longer time scale. We were able to detect precursory bubbles. This is the main cavitation, this is the big detrimental one. You can see the intensity is much higher. And those are two precursory bubbles. Precursory bubbles, because they start to happen before the big one. They're like a warning phase. It's like when we have an earthquake, it's at the beginning it shakes a bit, and then it shakes a lot. For example, dogs are able to detect this scenario. So what we were aiming to detect something that would tell the patient, the physician, that something is going wrong. And these precursory bubbles actually do that. We were able to know that these are harmless because the integral of this acoustic sound is actually small, because we were able to calculate this using the previous graph. Since we were able to correlate integral of the sound, integral of the acoustic signal with the ablation volume, we use this to calculate the integral or the effect of these precursory bubbles, and it showed that they didn't have a big effect, that they were actually harmless. And this is actually a hissing phenomenon. It's like a noise, a bigger noise actually, because it's due to multiple layers having micro vents, which when the water is start boiling, the vents are the steam is moving through these vents. It's not allowing an accumulation, another sudden rupture. However, you can see that those are not enough, and they're preceded by sudden pop. So what can we see here in this graph? You can see two warning signs that the clinician could use in order to stop the operation and know that something is going wrong. And these two phenomena have a order from 5 to 15 seconds. So we have plenty of time to warn the physician and tell him something is wrong, you need to stop. So what are the take-home messages? The power during ablation, power and time are not interchangeable, and we have seen that power is much more important and detrimental than time. The probability maps develop applicable at all catheter angles between 90 and 30. We know that there is a positive correlation between the intensity of the pulse and the blood volume. And finally, we have discovered, or actually we have found two precursory phenomena, which are the precursory bubbles and the hissing phenomena, and both could be used as a warning sign to tell the physician that something is wrong. And at the end, I would like to thank my teammates from the Faculty of Medicine and also from the Faculty of Engineering. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
So are you suggesting this new mechanism as a replacement to something, or this is a new procedure, adding acoustics as a new signal or a new warning?
Okay.
That part I did not get.
Catheter ablation has been used since quite a long time, but still the use of acoustic in catheter ablation is still very new. Until now, to my knowledge, it's not still clinically used. However, research is being done in this phase. Since we have seen that we have precursory phenomena happening before a big cavitation, which is something bad, that the physician does not want does not want to tear the myocardium of a patient. This can be used as a warning sign. To trigger a machine and to tell the physician something is going wrong, we need to lower the power, we need to stop, we need to inject more saline solution. So yes, this can have a clinical and is clinical and can be used as a warning sign. Did I answer your question?
In a bit, yeah. I was asking whether there are any other technologies currently in use. What are the current tricks that physicians use to detect?
Usually what they do is they use ultrasound, and the bubbles are opaque in ultrasound. So when it's actually, they can detect when it starts popping, not precursory popping. So what they do is the one they ablate, and they use an ultrasound, and when they start to see a white flashes, they would know something is going wrong. But this is in the order of seconds, and what I'm suggesting is in the order of 5 to 10 seconds.
So I'm suggesting that you should escape the power versus time, this probability. Yes. So are you suggesting anything below the blue area and the safe area?
Yes, exactly.
So what's used in the practice, the daily practice currently?
Okay.
What's the power level that's used in the read operations?
Okay. This is actually used on ovine heart, which is sheep hearts.
Not in the experiment.
Okay.
In real life.
In real life, if a doctor wants to use this catheterization
On a real
patient, what's the level of power?
Okay, usually it's varying. It depends on the case. The only thing that's constant is the weight. It's 20 grams.
Okay, so what's the level of power that's used in the...
Usually it's around 20 to 25. So it's I cannot tell you from this graph, but if I remember well, it should be around 20 to 40 seconds, or 20, or
Well, I'm talking about the time. I'm talking about the power level.
Yeah, the power is dependent on time. The higher the power, the lower the time.
I don't know. So forget about the time.
Okay, it's usually 20 volt,
20.
or 15, 20.
So statistic, for example, you use maybe 25 watt with 30 seconds, and this would be a safe operation.
From this point, I cannot interpolate this because this is an in vitro experiment, and you're applying it to in vivo conditions, and the heart is different. A human heart has different characteristics than an ovine heart. However, the same trends are available. The same shift has been observed in vivo conditions in dogs. But for a human application, we need a lot of more research in this case. And if you suggest using this point, I would not really recommend it because it does not have a safety factor. It could be dangerous. Yeah. But the trends are there. Yes, definitely.
Other questions?
And I just have an observation. If you go to the linear trend, the one that you said is a linear trend.
Positive correlation?
This one, if you look at the last 2 points, unless the lower one is an outlier, your conclusion is not right.
Okay.
So you need to revisit this. Either both are outlier, the lower one is an outlier, or if they are both correct, then you might have a random distribution. You might want to do heavier statistical analysis here.
This is probably an outlier. It will be included because of the fact that you're using volume here.
Possibly, but I'm talking about a conclusion
Yeah,
you said in your talk.
No, we had a lot of discussion of this curve in particular. It was very give and take.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now we move to the last talk in the first part of this session by Karen Maldi. And the talk is entitled Egg Effect. Very nice.
Thank you. There are no architects here, I guess, right? So you guys have to bear with me a bit. So my name is Karen Mondi, and my title is called The Edge Effect. I'll explain what the term means later on throughout my presentation. Birds are the metaphor for peace, non-settlement, and freedom, and they operate in the air on their very own superhighway. However, these flocks that pass over the Middle East are shot down by hunters, exploited by tourists, and killed as they hit into Israeli military planes. So therefore, birds were an integral part during my research as an architect student at this department. So this year-long research conducted for my final year project focuses on the occupied territories of Palestine and Jordan because it's a bottleneck for bird migration. Now, it is also the very same migratory route that caused the loss of more lives and money for the Israeli Air Force, more than the actual resistance, because birds and military planes fly at similar altitudes. So this has led to an interest in monitoring bird migratory patterns. And as you can see here, suddenly the Israeli population became much more interested in monitoring birds for their own safety. So my main thesis question was, how can architecture that aims to save the environment and the ecosystem fall onto this occupied territory of Jordan and Palestine, yet still serve the occupiers and the occupied? Israel has occupied 1,800 square kilometers of the Julan Heights for its strategic, political, and military implications, as well as its water source. The Julan is a junction between four countries. However, it is only accessible for the Israeli population and foreigners from the left side, and the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force from the right side. It is also the ground for 30 Jewish settlements and about 20,000 Syrians from the Druze sect. So the architecture intervention needs to prove that one can design a space where so many different and conflicting parties can inhabit it with much adjacency and order, while reconstructing the relationship they each have with the environment, with the ground, and the air as well. So there's this quote that I read from a book called Architecture of Resistance by a Palestinian architect called Nahar Sharif, and she pointed out that even the birds have become acquainted with the political and militarized tactics of Israel by falling into the security apparatuses imperceptible web. So basically, sorry, just 1 second. So as a first step, I mapped out where all the bird centers are, where the bird observation point and the bird locations are, so I can start understanding where my intervention needs to start happening along on this urban scale. So as a first point, I picked out the white stork as the targeted bird because white storks are large carnivorous migratory birds that are both time and energy So by researching and studying the white storks, migratory patterns, eating habits, and stopover sites, can a relationship be built between nature and architecture? So basically the white storks breed in Northwest Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, and use the eastern migratory route through western Syria and the Jordan Valley. And the reason why targeting these birds is crucial because the large size of the autumn flocks in the Middle East, which means about 20,000 birds, makes it difficult for an individual white stork to actually find proper food due to scarce food and water sources. So as a result, usually the white storks bypass a lot of stopover sites in the Middle East and they increase their migratory speeds. So I was thinking that perhaps adding points that would attract more birds or aid in the migration process. So, and this site is essential because after rainy water season, more food and water sources are available in the Middle East in spring in comparison to autumn. And throughout the month of March, conditions are normally good after rain in the mountain regions such as the Julan, which I have selected. White storks are heavily dependent on winds to conserve energy during flight because prevailing winds have the strongest effect on the migration passage and rates of the soaring birds. Now, this diagram shows that usually white storks or migratory birds in general depend on the headwind and tailwind to assist it in the migration, while you have the headwinds which are parallel to the bird but going against it, so they kind of inhibit a migratory route. And then you have the side winds which would be perpendicular to the migratory route of the bird. So for my research, I overlaid migratory routes of white storks flying in from Greece, Poland, and Russia with the Julan border to form intersections that would become possible sites of intervention. The points of intersection were near three crucial points. First, to the top left, I have the Banias Nature Reserve. The second point in the middle is the Konaitra checkpoint, which is the only opening to the rest of Syria. And at the bottom is the last strip of the United Nations Disengagement Observation Force Buffer Zone. So basically, I superimposed the direction of the migratory route with the monthly windrows diagram to establish if the three sites are in fact permitting a smooth migration. And in all cases, it showed that the direction of the wind is either a side wind or a headwind, and they're not interfering with the actual migration process. So, in order to manage stopover sites of migratory white storks and protect their health, the architectural intervention must also include a technological component that allows for this continuous observation and research on details regarding habitat use, factors influencing migratory pattern, and as well as wintering behavior. Now, signals from transmitters usually disappear when birds reach more populated areas that have uncontrolled activities. Therefore, it is essential to have the three stopover sites that I have already mentioned in the form of architectural buildings that continuously investigate and ensure that the tracking of birds along with their health and safety remains intact. So, these three sites' locations in sacrificial zones can be intervened on and modified using architecture as a tool to locate, map, and design. Therefore, the design thesis intervenes on two layers. You have the top-down as a design methodology used as a guideline to locate and design for sites falling under the post-war and occupied category. Then you have the bottom-up, which informs a specific building typology that focuses on each site's needs in relation to other sites' common needs. So basically, I have an architectural intervention that kind of is the form of the yin and yang. So you have one form that is common to all three sites, and then you have the other part of the building that would focus on the immediate context that the building is required to serve. For the first site, it's called Banias Nature Reserve. Basically, because of the occupation, this site turned from a local lift settlement to an international selective that is tourist attraction. due to the presence of the Hermon stream. You have also Roman temple ruins, you have a wine press, you have old synagogue ruins, and so on. The architectural building that would be added to the site can feed this bird watching craze because, since it is already very popular among tourists that come to see the ancient ruins and natural features. And I selected this site as the major aviary hub. And this is a collage that I did to show how I have this dual nature. It was just like a conceptual approach. This is how we usually start for an architectural vision. So basically, I have one side to the right, which focuses on the existing ruins on the site, and then you have the ecological factor on the left that would be common to all the other interventions. The second is the Konaitra checkpoint. Basically, apples are the only link that the remaining Syrian farmers have to the rest of Syria, and usually the Red Cross are the only ones who are allowed to transport the apples from Julan to the rest of Syria. And these apples take months before they can actually be transported into the demilitarized zone. So basically, this collage shows that because apples take months on end, and I marked up earlier. Here, I did like a time comparison, and usually it takes about the red portion, the circle, usually takes about 10 months for the apples to actually be transported. So this shows that apple storage is actually crucial to be considered in the project. For the last site, I called it the buffer strip in the buffer zone. Basically, this site, because it's located in the bottom of the Unduk buffer zone, it leaves the riverbank of the Yarmouk River that I presented in the collage with a UN observation post on the higher altitude. So now I need to explain what a buffer strip is. A buffer strip is a permanently vegetated strip of land that is usually surrounding the river, and usually you have you have vegetation and I don't know. Sorry. You have short grass and a lot of the contact animals, so it helps control the air, water, and soil. And because this site is remote and not susceptible to human exposure, the proposal suggests for the introduction of an aid of a vulnerable bird species, which I picked as the marble duck because they are vulnerable in the region, and that can reside along this buffer strip. Now, I need to talk about representation, and the reason why I picked the pixel as a means of representation throughout all of the three collages is because humans cannot be detected on Google Earth due to being smaller than the size of the pixel. And because all of my research on this occupied site had to be digital and it had to be online, and I cannot access the site, so I felt like this is the most thing that would actually help me represent the project. So because humans are smaller than the size of a pixel and cannot be detected on Google Earth, it's usually what protects us, but in many cases, this is also what allows injustice, war, and crime to occur undetectedly. And usually the pixel helps form a neutralized container that absorbs the repetitive and unique elements in its context. It adapts to the borders by feeding on what they divide and to create a shared and neutralized ecosystem within and around them. So this architectural intervention comes in the form of several aviaries along the Julan to form a catchment area for the monitoring, studying, and aid of migratory resident and newly introduced birds. The aviaries must include a radar system, a research component, a microclimatic bird housing component, and a bird hospital. By enveloping the people in a space dominated by birds, building typologies generated where man abides to the needs of nature instead of having it the other way around. So basically, edge effect is an act of resistance to the architecture that turns the traditional aviary inside out. Usually, edge effect is a term used that means the result of a sudden change from one ecological community to another adjoining one on the common varied organisms that reside in the borderline territory, which is what's happening in the case of the Julan, where the occupied and the occupied are cohabitating. So this project aims to prove that in order for architecture to resist politics, it must transcend it and work on greater issue, the environment. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Karen.
Yeah.
We have a room for questions.
Can you explain your last point? I do not understand how can architecture or anything, not that I have anything against architecture, how can architecture, engineering, science, or anything resist politics?
Okay, so usually for like a final year project, it would be interesting just to try to question how we can resist politics in the form of architecture, and I know this can be difficult. So what I was suggesting was to resist politics, I have to forget about it and work on the bigger scale, which is the environment that would affect both parties that are conflicting. Okay, this was a debate I was having all year round, but it's but like in politics, you always have different viewpoints, and for me, this was my viewpoint, using eco-activism to try to fight the current political situation. So it's like we both parties acknowledge the fact that this is what's happening to our environment, so we need to both work on it at the same time, and because they're already cohabitating. So does that make any sense?
I mean, if you want to win with politics, you need to understand its constraints and add it as a design constraint.
Okay, but here's the thing. This argument is kind of flawed because you can never win with politics. So, if people can win with politics, the political situation wouldn't be like this in the country or the Arab region. So, I don't think, it's like arguing about religion. You will never reach a common consensus. So it's just one viewpoint for how we can tackle the issue. That's it. Okay.
So you can explain this edge. What does it mean exactly?
Yeah, it's usually when you have like an ecological community here, and then you have another one here. So it's the effect that they have on each other. Like let's say you have a river bank, and then you have an agricultural field. So you have different organisms that would reside on either side, and the edge effect is this transition, this threshold between the two, and the effect that they have on each other.
So like it's Golan height. What's the edge effect?
The edge effect
it's the same, probably same.
No, but it's more of a conceptual term. I used it just to try to conceptualize how you have the occupiers and the occupied trying to reside in close proximity.
All right, I think with this, we can have our team, and we'll come back at that. So the next, the last is Zainab Swaidan. Her talk is entitled Double Error Cellular Automata Based Error Correction with Skip Mode Impact Syndrome Coded for Resilient Tough Design. I know what cellular automata is, but that is unidirectional. Please go ahead.
My name is Zainab Swaidan. I'm presenting the double error cellular automata error correction code. With a skip multi-assist syndrome for both designs. This work was done with my colleagues, Matthew, Anthony, Adam, and Hassan, along with the supervision of my advisor, Professor Ali Shah. In this presentation, we will have motivation for the work, a background review on top and background on the puff and ring oscillators, then the cellular automata design and results, and at the end we have an application with a code. So, with the increase of the advent of technology and the the span of applications in the world, we have around 9 billion connected devices. This number is expected to explode to be 25 billion in 2020. Therefore, any security breach on these connected devices will affect the communication worldwide and will alter millions of users in the world. Therefore, it's critical for the Internet of Things devices to have a secure communication which is cheap and reliable. For this reason, we'll be using intrinsic process variations in chips to generate secret keys, and this will be done using physical unclonable functions known as PUFs. So what is PUF? PUF is a digital fingerprint that serves as a unique identity for semiconductor devices. As mentioned before, we'll be relying on intrinsic variations in chips in order to generate these keys. So for any challenge given, we will have a response that is unique and cannot be replicated. The PUF can be implemented in two versions, either in a ring oscillator, which is made of simple inverters, or using complex circuit elements such as memory cells. In our implementation, we rely on the ring oscillator PUF. In this, given a challenge, we'll need an identical ring oscillators placed in different locations to have different frequencies. Then a response is generated. However, due to variations in environmental variables such as a change in temperature or a change in voltage, the response for the challenge is not unique. So designers rely on error correction code in order to have a unique response once the chip is used. For that reason, we have the conversion, we have the code offset construction for the error correcting code. This is summarized as below. We have a response vector which is made up of k-bit message vector amp and n minus k vector c. The k vector bit amp is going to be fed to the encoder, and we will get n minus k vector check bits. These check bits are resolved with the n minus k vector c in order to have the helper vector n minus k bit. Upon deployment, this helper vector is absorbed with C prime. In the deployment part, we have a response vector R prime, which is made up of an M prime and C prime vectors. Then the M prime, in addition with the absorbed result of H and C prime, are fed into the decoder. The result of a decoder is a k-bit vector amp, which is the So, the cellular automata is a mathematical idealization of physical systems and secrete in space and time, which are discrete. In our case, the CA cell is made up of a D flip-flop and a next state function. This next state function depends on the current state along with two of its neighbors, according to these cellular automata rules. The general form of a cellular automata is NKT, where N represents the block size, K is a number of information bits, and T is a Hamming distance between code words. For our implementation, we will be using 1575 cellular automata, which means the block is divided into several 15-bit blocks, and each with 7 information bits. The encoder algorithm is based on matrix algebra. So the steps are as follows. We have to construct a TK matrix, which is based on the cellular automata rules. This matrix is computed 3 times in order to obtain a TK cube matrix. In this matrix, we alter one of its rows, and then we add 2 additional rows for the matrix in order to obtain an encoder matrix T prime. This scheme can be done or can be designed using circuits. In the circuit part, we have a K cell CA. This cell is run 3 times in order to obtain a TK cube matrix. The output of this cell is fed into a combinatorial logic in order to go from a k-bit vector into n minus k-bit vector. The resultant should be identical to the T prime matrix which we obtained from the algorithm, which is an n minus k by k matrix. In order to implement this circuit, we have to use a finite state machine to compute the TK cube matrix. This is done using 3 states in addition to a reset enable, clock enable, and counter sequence. Then we have the K-cell logic. This is a scheme for the K-cell logic, which is based on XORing functions. In addition, we have a D flip-flop and mux. The bits are initialized, and the output is fed into a combinatorial logic. Finally comes the decoder part. The decoder part is made up of the encoder already designed, along with a map that consists of all the errors, and with unprime, which is k-bit vector, along with the check bits absorbed with the helper bits. And the result of this, and the result from the decoder is the error vector, which represents the locations of the errors in our user. So this the encoder decoder design was implemented on Xilinx, and we were able to find that the critical path corresponds to 3.7 nanoseconds. And these are the results that we obtained from statistics. We have the number of IUTs and number of flip-flops for each module. In addition to that, we have the time needed for each module and the power consumed in each module. We can notice that the decoder consumes 25 IUTs and this have the highest delay and power consumption. From Viva, we were able to get some schematics. The first one is for the case LCA, which we already explained, and the second one is for the hub. We also have the behavior simulation. In this, the behavior simulation, we send the message. We send a vector which consists of a message and a check bit. We already designed errors in this message, and we were able to get the error vector, which indicates the position of the errors, as can see in the E vector. In addition to that, we have studied the latency. We are able to show that we have 4 clock cycles for the case LCA and additional 3 clock cycles for the other combinatorial logic, which makes up the latency, the total latency, 26 nanoseconds. However, if we replace the case LCA and the combinatorial logic with the T matrix of the encoder, and we get rid of the 3 clock cycles, the 3 word cycles, we can reduce the total latency to 14.8 nanoseconds. We were able to have a real implementation on an ASIC, and we can show that the critical path delay is reduced into 0.71 nanoseconds instead of 3.7 nanoseconds discussed earlier. And these are some of the statistics obtained in terms of level of logic and the design area. So the encoder-decoder design is obtained, and now we want to use it in an application. My colleagues work on the application to enhance the entropy of the generated bits by POP. And in this scheme, they get the data from Virginia Tech, and they go through the following steps. They extracted randomness, and then they have the Lisa grouping, and then they designed a skip mode CSC. After they are done, we send it to the error correcting code in order to generate the code words. For this application, we have the following graph that shows the results. When using the skip mode design, we can see that we can minimize or decrease the number of error bits at different temperatures instead of using the no skip path. In conclusion, we were able to implement on Xilinx a cellular automata of 15.7.5. We were able to show that the critical path is 3.7 nanoseconds, and we're able to generate the total latency of 26 nanoseconds. However, we can decrease this latency in 14.8 if we replace some of the blocks already. Thank you.
Maybe you want to tell us what is the difference
نحكي مع فارما.
Okay, in the implementation, not on the real implementation. On the implementation on a software tool, we were able to show that the total path or the critical path uses 3.7 nanoseconds. However, if we go to implement it really, it uses 0.7 nanoseconds, which is faster, which is less than the critical path obtained before, and on the implementation, not on the real implementation.
So if I want to ask you the later slide on the ASIC, which one is closer to a real chip? This one or the
This one is closer to a real chip.
So she did two implementations, one on a testing bench and one that shows the closer numbers if this was to be fabricated. Usually when they build a design, they build it first on a testing and infrastructure, and then if it is validated, people then migrate it to the next stage, which is what will really go to the fabrication. But we don't have the infrastructure to fabricate it.
What are the implications of the work?
Okay, so we have sometimes we have an error that we have an error if we have a certain challenge.
Can you give an example just to make it so that everybody in this room will understand what exactly you're doing and why you're doing it?
A non-technical.
Yeah. حدا ما بيعرف شيء بالإلكتريكال انجينيرينج.
Can you go to the slide?
Can you give an example where this can be used?
Well, this kind of
Example. مثلا processing time مثلا computer. I'm running a simulation.
Okay, so the application was done by my colleague. The application, I get the error correcting code, and they use in one of the application. In the application, they have a data, and in this data here, in this data we have frequencies, some random frequency that they are not as well, they don't behave well. So we extracted this random frequency. And then we have a grouping of for example, we have 4 groups, A, B, C, D, and each are mapped into S. Okay?
So frequency يعني, to me as an engineer means what? Amplitude and hertz, right?
Yes.
So then you divide these frequencies that are
We extract the random frequency that we don't know. We are left with some of the frequency that what we really want. Okay? We have something. We work with the grouping. We group some of these frequency into A, B, C, D, and this grouping are mapped into bits, 1 and 0 bits. If any error happens in this grouping, it will alter the bits. If A, B, C correspond to 1, 0, 1, if any change in this grouping due to environmental variations in temperature or voltage voltage, it will alter the bits. So once this alters the bits, we will get errors, right? So what we want to do is to have something to correct these errors, or at least to let us know where are the errors.
Okay, where the changes has happened.
Yes. So we have this data generated. We send this data into the error correcting scheme or the error correcting code. This error correcting code will provide us with an error vector that represents the places of errors. So we know that we have error. Okay.
Thank you.
Next we have Ms. Tala Shahadi, who's going to talk on visible Lebanese government. One nice
Visible Lebanese. Government?
Yeah. So hello, my hello, my name is Fea Ideas, and I'm a fourth-year graphic design student, and my FYK is
defining the Lebanese government's identity that seems to be lacking visual threads or links that relate the ministries to the institutions themselves. So, to talk more about this, if you want, this is the brand architecture of the Lebanese government, where you can see what a brand architecture means, how the government functions in terms of the ministries and then the institutions that fall under each ministry. So this is kind of the organization scheme of the Lebanese government. And as you can see, it's overwhelming. A lot of this, it's a very complex brand architecture. So my approach to making this project applied, I asked myself many questions, and the main question was, what's the value of using design as a tool to create a reliant and transparent government-citizen relationship, and how can design reflect the government's existing efforts to ameliorate? So just to give you a very, these are a collection of the ministry's logos. As you can see, some of them, they look very old, like they've done ages ago. Some of them have the more contemporary feel, as you can see in the Ministry of Telecommunications. Some of them are well done, like the logo of the Ministry of Tourism. Others have this fake computer-generated effect, as you can see here, like the shield where you can see the gradient that actually does look fake. So as you can see, there is no such thing as like a unified scheme within the ministry's logos themselves. And these are the logos of the institutions that fall under what we saw earlier. So as you can see here, we can't really know when looking at these which belongs to which ministry. And maybe, because maybe you would think, okay, these are just logos, I don't care about how I'm going to see the institutions, how they're going to be visually presented. Some of you may be familiar with these, or these logos, or the ministry's logos. Some of you never even noticed them, and don't really know which logo belongs to which ministry. And some of you may think that it's not necessary to know these, but maybe you will change your mind when it comes to the parking ticket. Okay, so this precious document that I'm sure all of you have seen it at least once in your life so through its branding, you don't know to which ministry your money is going to. And clarifying the links between the institutions and the ministries will actually clarify how the government functions, and maybe it will make the Lebanese government, a more transparent and visible Lebanese government identity. So, as you can see here, this parking ticket belongs to the Ministry of Interior and Municipalities. However, on the parking ticket itself, we don't see the link. So maybe this can be translated into obstructing, like kind of hiding where your money goes to. Not exactly, but yeah. So I went into several. I did my research on ministries' identity, government identities worldwide, and the Dutch government identity marked me the most because it was designed by Studio Dunbar in 2004. And as you can see, they have this element or emblem constant, and then what changes across the identity is just what they write next to it. For example, this is the Ministry of Defense, this is the Ministry of Finance, etc. And you can see that this is a very unified, very rigid identity. You see the same emblem all over the card, ID, on signage, on buildings, even on their website. Okay. So, as you've seen, the case of the Lebanese government and the case of the Dutch government. So I was trying to see how I can divide my approach to actually coming up with answers to how I can solve this issue. So I divided it into 3 categories. The first one is about the nature of the visual identity. So I asked myself, can we have a unified frame, or is it better to showcase the Lebanese diversity through the diverse representation of the government? Okay, so we've seen the Dutch government's identity. It's very rigid and it's very Dutch. It's not Lebanese. And even if you disagree with me on this point, looking at the Lebanese government's logos, there's this kind of truth behind it. Like, this is Lebanon. There's this diversity within the logos. However, they are not well done because they're not thought of as a unified within a system. So, and another question is, should the designs be traditional in order to gain credibility, especially when we're talking about the government, should be credible or and trusted, or should it be modern in order to have a contemporary feel, thus highlight the idea of development and innovation? So, in order to answer this question, I took the Lebanese American University as my case study. For LAU, they have this logo. It was basically the seal, the stamp that they used, and then they made it their logo. So when they had to put it on a very small business card, it was so tiny that الجامعة اللبنانية الأمريكية wasn't even legible. So Malika pre-designed their identity, and they made the seal or the stamp even more detailed, because it's still gonna be like this big. It's not gonna be blown up, so nothing will change. And then they took the logo. They have the constant part, which is this one. And then because LAU is a university that has departments under it, so they added this part that changes across each department, and to give like each department their own voice. Okay, so the second part of my investigation was about symbolism. So as you've seen before, like if you can see here, the prominence of the cedar is almost everywhere. So I was asking myself, should I keep it, should I not? But then so this is a kind of snapshot of my FYP tool. I designed, okay, it's not, some of them are distorted, however. So I decided to steer away from the realistic shape edges of the cedar and rather go into something more abstract to give like this contemporary feel to an ever-present symbol that we were all familiar with. So the third part is about achieving transparency and inclusiveness. How can we do this? How can design achieve transparency for the government? How come design is not reflective of the government's effort to ameliorate, if there are any? And how can we create an identity that would be inclusive to all the Lebanese citizens? So these are some of the logos that I did. Okay, they're very bad. They shouldn't be like this. I don't know if it's anyway. So my approach to having this treatment of the Lebanese government, these are the ministry's logos. I had this part. It's not it doesn't show really well. This part is when we have, like we're used to having the cedar and then under it Al-Jumhuriyya Al-Lubnaniya. So this is a part that is reminiscent of the already existing kind of like the codes of the Lebanese government. And then I wanted to add some illustrations that would actually make it accessible to everyone, even kids who want to know, okay, for example, when we look at Ministry of Education, it doesn't really show again, but you can see that there's a book, there's the film, there's the pen, there's the ruler. It doesn't really show. And
you can zoom on one of them.
You can see that وزارة الصحة. See?
Use the plus.
Yes, so this is for the Ministry of, it still doesn't show. The Ministry of, that's Harama. So you can see the so like symbols and codes, so they can people who are the kids or illiterate people or people who wouldn't bother reading which ministry this belongs to, they would actually maybe, like when they directly see it, they might directly associate it with the symbols that they use. And I also, for one example, for the Ministry of Environment, I used وزارة البيئة. I used the striped hyena because we don't know. Actually, I really doubt that some of you know that, but the striped hyena is actually the symbol, like the animal of the Lebanese government. And I was really shocked when I knew that, but I wanted to really raise awareness within, like to take this opportunity to actually raise awareness on an animal that represents our country, yet it is very endangered because like people kill it for no reason. So just like trying to understand. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll ask. So you're trying to find a new identity that sort of an umbrella that puts all the ministries together. What I did not understand, you changed a variable logo, a small one, the variations of the cedar, and also a variable topic. Whereas if you want to, if I learned something from the Dutch experiment, it was keep the main crown or fix and then change the name. And you were complaining about the variability of the Lebanese.
I wasn't complaining about the diversity.
Highlighting it. What I saw here is even more variability. I mean, I would have expected maybe a unified cedar and a change, but that's only my opinion.
Yeah, I thought about this. However, if you think about it properly, I didn't say that I wasn't against diversity in the country. I was with diversity. However, a well-thought system that can have room for diversity, and thus I wanted for each ministry to have its own voice, even within the cedar, because the idea of the cedar, it's a cedar. And the constant part is the position of the box.
And that's the only constant thing.
Yeah, and the tower. And because what I said that there's a kind of it was kind of the easy way out. I could have done it very easily, focus on one cedar, because the whole point is to over exaggerate the diversity, the diverse aspect of it, not to fall into the Dutch system, because I'm not saying that the Dutch system is not nice black. I really believe that having something constant would make sense for the people. However, it's not Lebanese of us to do this, and I didn't want to fake our identity by kind of change. Okay, no, we're now Dutch. We want this very square and very clean. And no, I wanted to keep this aspect that it is Lebanon. It is for Lebanon. Whether we agree or not, it is a messy country, and it is a very diverse country, and we should embrace it. But maybe
let me tell you my opinion, since we are a messy country, shouldn't we do it organized? And you could have also inspired, it's just a suggestion, mixing the two. You know how they have in the diagram the cedar? Because typically the people need to know this is government. And to know that this is the government, you have to have one face for the government. With slight modification, so a blend of the cedar in the background with a specific stamp of a specific ministry would have given maybe a more orderly image for the government, which we really lack in application and on paper, So just keep that as a suggestion. It's different places. good way.
There can be so many ways of doing this identity, and I chose this one because it made more sense to me.
And you did good.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. So what this has to do with the target group?
I'm sorry?
What does this has to do with the target?
Okay, so, yeah.
How can you connect this design with the visibility in the government?
Because I didn't show you the continuous part of it because I'm still working on it. Because, it is actually making, you didn't see this part, so like, of course I was expecting this question. I was I'm still trying to make the institutions, you would know that, for example, this institution, for example, I'm going to give it an example, the ISF, you know that it falls under the Ministry of Interior and Municipality. So within the branding of the ISF, I'm going to have the CEDAR that belongs to the ministry to reply on your question as well. So this is why I wanted each CEDAR different than Haida, because the endorsement, how the link between the institutions and the ministries, they will be shown through the presence of this token that is representative of the ministry that it falls under it. And this is how I'm making it visible. So you can know that, okay, I'm dealing with ISF, then therefore I'm dealing with the Ministry of Interior and Interior and Municipality. For example, I'm going to the National Museum, therefore I'm dealing with the Ministry of Culture. I'm going to, to do these links, because I feel like this is what lacks, and this is my idea of clarifying this brand architecture so people can know should know what they're dealing with. And this would make it.
So now we should have our last talk by Ala Haddad. It's a very title. A multi-topic corpus for target-based sentiment analysis in Arabic 11 times.
Hello everyone, my name is Ala Haddad. I'm second year undergraduate student at the Electrical and Computer Department, and I'm doing undergraduate research with Dr. Hazim Hash. Today I'll be presenting a multi-topic corpus for target-based sentiment analysis in Arabic humanities. To break this down, we've all heard about the hype of machine learning and AI, and there's something like computer vision. For example, the flying drones that can bound people in boxes, or in natural language processing, for example, Amazon Alexa, Amazon and Echo as well, where they can interpret your voice commands and connect a smartphone system that runs those commands. One of the subfields of natural language processing is sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis refers to the art of inferring sentiment from text. For example, if I say way to go, I infer positive sentiment. But if I say too bad, that's a negative sentiment. And research in this area has been driven by two main models. First, the huge amount of data available online, and second, by its wide range of application. For example, on the Google search bar, when you type something, it automatically predicts the next word before you even type them. And this is an application of sentiment analysis. Today, social media has connected people across the globe and allowed them to express their opinion freely. And Twitter, being one of the most used social media platforms, contributes daily to 500 million tweets. Arabic is considered the fourth most spoken language worldwide. We have about 11.1 million Arab Twitter users who generate 27.4 million tweets daily. Research in sentiment analysis has been very advanced in English, but still lags behind other languages, and especially in Arabic due to its morphological complexity. When considering sentiment analysis, we first have to consider 3 points. The target of the main sentiment. For example, لم ينجح المهاجمون في مواجهة أسرار المدافعين. The main sentiment is towards the attackers, while it can personal hostility towards the defenders. Second point is the different ways to express sentiment. For example, I love this card, it's amazing. This is explicit way. While I say this card is my type, I'm implicitly inferring that this card I like. The third point, semantics differ across topic. So large tend to be positive when describing TVs, everyone is buying a widescreen TV. But large cameras tend to be very practical. So large shield is negative. Fourth point, semantics differ across Arab regions. For example, subhanAllah is used abundantly in the Gulf countries and considered neutral most of the time, while Lebanon will only use it at positive moments. And finally, lexical items differ across dialects. For example, the negation expression. مش in Lebanese, ما Lebanese, مو in Syrian, لا and ما فيش other in Lebanese and other European countries. In general, most supervised machine learning algorithms require relevant features. What do we mean by relevant features? For example, trying to predict the house price, I need to know its size, its location, but I don't need to know what I'm wearing to predict its price. Same thing applies for sentiment analysis. We need to know the sentiment assigned with each text. So this solution has been available through sentiment corpora, which is a set of text that has been manually assigned to sentiment labels by field experts or by paid jobs via crowdsourcing. But most of the sentiment corpora that were released only targeted sentiment or topic, but or some other domain like POS or tag. But they never combined it together. So in our research, we propose to create a corpus that has Arabic text retrieved from the Twitter. And it was annotated for sentiment polarity, target of the sentiment, the expression, implicit or explicit, topic being discussed, and the dialect. In our case, we consider the 19 dialects: Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Jordan. If we take a look at existing corpora in modern standard Arabic, لغة الفصحى, most of them are annotated on 3-point scale: negative, positive, or neutral, and some of them added objective option, while very few contain the 5-point scale, which shows the extreme points. If we take a look at the dialectical existing corpora, most are retrieved from Twitter or Yahoo or Facebook, and same applies 3-point scale or adding a mixed. And very few, as you can see here too, are annotated on 5-point scale. Before creating our data set, we performed a pilot study. We collected 200 tweets and manually analyzed them to get insights to the most common topics being discussed in this region, how language is discussed, and how sentiment is generally expressed. Looking at the topic distribution, you can see that 36% of the tweets discuss personal issues. People exploiting their love, their hate for something, being sarcastic about some things. Second thing, 23% political, where people discuss Syrian, Palestinian war, Lebanese elections, revolution, terrorism. 11% shared religious verses. 6% discussed international and local soccer games or basketball. And 24% other, like entertainment, arts, education, and other topics. Looking at the language distribution, 48% were written in modern standard Arabic, while 37% using Levantine and about 8% for English and Arabic. Now, it's worth noting that the political tweets were most commonly written in MSA, while personal works commonly written in Levantine. And analyzing the sentiment distribution across the countries, we can see that varies from country to another. The general trend is negative, while the most negative was being in Syria due to its ongoing war, and most neutral in Jordan. And we can see that 64% of the sentiment is expressed explicitly, 35% implicitly, which indicates the complexity due to the implicit 35%. Our corpus development was made up of 4 stages. First, the pre-retrieval. Second, the pre-processing phase. Third, the annotation. And finally, the post-processing. To retrieve tweets, we use the pre-Python model. We specified the geolocations of Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Jordan, and started retrieving tweets. The 5th of November and ended on 29th of November. We retrieved about 45,000 tweets, equally distributed about across the 4 countries. This is about 12,000 per country. The second phase before annotating them was the pre-processing phase. Here we used our results from the pilot study. We first create like a naive classifier. For example, from the distribution of topics, we saw that we had 33% personal, 23% political, and so on. So we created lists containing topic-specific keywords. We checked the three tweets contain at least one of those keywords. We kept it, otherwise we left it out. Now this is a naive classification problem, but we did it to increase the likelihood of that we're discussing our target topics. We also exclude tweets written in foreign languages or containing URLs and emoticons, even though they're relevant, but they're outside the scope of our research. Then we selected the 1,000 longest tweets per country and moved to the third step, which is annotation. We refer to using Crowdflower platform. Crowdflower is a platform where you can pass tweet or text or anything, and they pay money to people to annotate your data, and they check for their address. For example, each receiver is assigned 5 to 9 annotators. You have to see that the overall sentiment plurality of 5-point scale, from very negative to very positive. We also had to identify the target for which the sentiment was expressed. For example, if I say I like this car, the sentiment expressed was the car. The target is car. Third, we have to identify the sentiment expression. Is it explicit or implicit? And finally, we have identify the topic, politics, religion, sports, or other. In case it doesn't apply, we have to apply their own judgment. Labels were aggregated based on majority, and the annotator's trust score was used to break ties. To assess the quality of this annotation, we manually annotated 183 tweets, which were used to assess the annotators. When annotators had trust score below 75% on our golden dataset, our annotation was excluded from the class. For sentiment target aggregation, the longest common substring of targets was chosen. Here, one annotator predicted by the label, he manually chose the targets from the sentence. To have the most agreement, we chose the longest common substring. And when they identified with their own words, we fixed those manually. For the topic aggregation, since they were on a 4-point personal politics, sports, or other, we chose majority voting. And finally, the 138 tweets were chosen fixed manually since they were with the annotated own words. Looking at the distribution of our corpus, you can see that 38% were political, 33% personal, 12% sports, 10% religious, and 4% other and data. The sentiment distribution was overall negative, 31% negative, going to neutral, 22%, 20% positive, and very negative, 16%, and finally very positive, 11%, which shows the negative trend. And sentiment was expressed 73.6% of the time explicitly, 22.1% no sentiment was inferred, and 4.3% sentiment was inferred implicitly. To assess the quality of our data set, we did 2 kinds of experiments. Same topic experiment and cross-topic experiment to emphasize the impact of topic change. Our features were unigrams and bigrams unity at IDF scores. Unigrams are set one word. Bigrams, all possible combination of 2 words. TF-IDF refers to term frequency inverse document frequency. To get the TF-IDF score of a word, we count how many times it occurred. Then we divided it by the number of documents that occurred in. For example, the common words like and although they occur a lot of times, but in many documents as well, so it had a lower score. While topic-specific keywords in engineering, for example, will occur on only engineering documents, but will occur a lot in those documents, so we'll have a higher score. We use MAN classifier to assess our work, like logistic regression, support vector machine random trees classifier. Logistic regression is like linear classification, but for binary. It predicts 0 or 1 and try to 0 1. And you will report only the results of logistic regression due to interpretability and since it performed well. To evaluate, we did 5-fold cross-validation, which means we tested on 5 different data sets, and we reported the accuracy, which means how much right we got and how much wrong. Looking first experiment, we tested on the whole data set with unigrams and bigrams only. We got an accuracy of 41%. Adding our annotation increased the accuracy to 60% absolute. Next, we did the same topic experiment. We tested on political and personal. We got 58 and 40% accuracy respectively. When changing topic, that means training on political and testing on personal, vice versa, the accuracy drops drastically, 31%, 56%, showing that topic is an essential feature in our model. And finally, to show the importance of sentiment expression, we train on personal and tested on political. Without annotation, 36% accuracy, and with our annotation, it increased 60%, which show the importance of sentiment expression annotation. In conclusion, we presented our corpus called RCPD Lab. Consists of 4,000 pieces collected for overall sentiment target for which the sentiment was expressed, the expression way, the topic being discussed, and the experiment results confirm the importance of these features. Future work including exploiting this data in domain adaptation. That means training a model on a source and testing on a different source, but having as well good results. Thank you for your time, and if you have any question, I'm all ears.
Or maybe a couple of questions.
So your algorithm can be used for, let's say, other platforms. What was the main conclusion here? Is that understanding the overall sentiment will lead to better understanding of the further details in it, or what would be your recommendation for?
Okay. So in general, when people try to predict based on text, there are many ways to present text. But they usually like unigrams and bigrams. We saw that they have a low accuracy score. But if you want to implement it in recommender systems, for example, that where you can type and they suggest some things for you, want them to be accurate as much as possible. This is an example. So we looked for relevant features to be used. One of the relevant features was the overall sentiment. Is it positive or negative? It affects that was our label. One of the features was the target for which the sentiment is expressed, and also is expressed explicitly or implicitly. By knowing the sentiment expressed implicitly or explicitly, we can increase our accuracy by 10%. By knowing the topic, is it someone talking about something that concerns them, is it not talking about something political or other things, we can also increase our accuracy by 13%.
So what is performance here? What is it that you are measuring?
Accuracy, how much to predict correct over the total.
Correct in those four categories? Is this statement political, sports, fashion?
Yeah. How much we got correct? Here we run on baseline models, we got actually about 64%. But the same of the art models, we can achieve about 90% accuracy, and it is to be included in a future paper, not this one. So we divided the work into two stages. Any other question? Thank you for your time.
Okay, I think